Hi. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this symposium. I'm really sorry not to be able to participate physically in Hong Kong, but I do hope that this video can be of interest for the whole symposium. So in 1988, 17-year-old singer and composer Tupac Shakur made a clear-sighted commentary on the absurd American society of the time. Quote, "We are not being taught to deal with the world as it is. We are being taught to deal with this fairyland that we are not even living anymore. And it's sad, because it's me telling you, and it should not be me telling you this. This should be common knowledge. Are they wondering why death rate is going up? And suicide is going up, and drug abuse is going up? Are they wondering? Don't they understand that more kids are being handed crack than being handed diplomas? Society is like that. They let you go as far as you want, but as soon as you start asking too many questions and you are ready to change, boom, that block will come." End of the quote. 30 years later, his words are still right to describe the society of enmity we are living in, to borrow the words of the last book of philosopher Achille Mbembe. Let me now make a small focus on the situation in France. We have recently experienced several deadly attacks executed by extremist young people who found in these terrible acts the only way for them to exist. My way to see it. We are confronting a strong identitarian crisis. Europe and France are stuck in fixed, essentialist representations of identity, failing to recognize that they are made per se of migrations. In France, several generations of immigrants are denied a real place in society. We observe movements of reterritorializations, polarizations, opposing the suburbs and the institution, be it the government, education, or museums, for instance. Young people don't recognize how institutions represent them. They even feel excluded from them. It even seems that anyone who can't be controlled is relegated outside the institution. They can't think their future. There is not even hope anymore. There is a growing gap between the young people and society. And this is really not new. Let's think about it for a moment. Institution was before, maybe not so long ago actually, inclusive in the way that it was capable of building itself from the difference and include autocritique. The institution was the one forming a critical mind of the established system. It was forming individuals for them to question its very existence. Today it is exclusive. Everyone who can't be controlled is then put aside of the institution. But they are now collapsing. There are too many people excluded from them. They can't continue the way they are. They have become foreign to many young people who don't relate with them anymore. One has to admit the incapacity of these institutions to not only draft a unifying project based on social justice and openness, but to simply represent in their narrative the contemporary complexity of trajectories that constitute the population of nation-states, be they immigrants, pre- and post-war to and recent refugee and asylum seekers. Can you believe, for instance, that there are only 4 teachers of contemporary Maghreb history in French universities? I consider, along with theoreticians Fatima El-Tayeb, Saskia Sassen, or philosopher Frank Ruda, that this omission from official narrative should be taken a possibility to organize subversion. It's time to reclaim our institutions. As Frank Ruda rightly questions, what if one takes the absence of a ground for a ground, the absence of freedom for freedom? It might help to shift the gaze a bit. Now, how to fight? With which tools? Should we learn to use the ones of our enemies, or should we invent some other strategies to challenge them? Let's look at the ones developed by Mexican-American poet Gloria Anzaldúa in her essay Autohistorias. Autohistorias is a poetic form made of assemblage of different words, languages, registers of language, testimony, tale, theory, poetry, in a non-linear way, very singular, where oppositions are overcome. It represents a kind of example of self-expression, transcending bipolarities and fixed categorization. Combinations of poetry and autobiography allow for critique and appropriation of linear models and categories. Here you can find the original manuscript of Autohistorias, where you can see the different notations from Gloria Anzaldúa and her definition of the concept. I have termed Autohistorias a hybrid form which transgresses genre laws by mixing with poetry, fiction, theory, and other genres. A challenge the male-centered subject of mainstream autobiography, as well as patriarchal gender genre theory. In a way, Autohistorias represents a kind of alternative mode of dealing with dominant ideology. It's not about assimilation nor opposition, but walking on the borders, destabilizing them, opening moments of disruption by creating a network of marginalized positionalities. And this is actually, in a way, this encapsulates my way of working at Béton Salon and Villa Vassiliev. And Autohistorias is also a way to really constantly slip on the borders. And for me, it's a perfect example to translate this idea that identity is not fixed but in permanent displacement. And displacement is of course a source of knowledge. And we could also call it diasporic knowledge, which would be more like a contemporary condition rather than a focus on the origin. A condition that is more close to this idea of a passerby, where you're being transformed through migration, through movement, and where actually regionalization is not something to deal with this idea of passing from one zone to the other and see what you can take from this different passage. So this is what we are trying to demonstrate at Villa Vassiliev by focusing on itineraries, journeys that are made of deviations, influences, resistances, asserting deeply entangled connections, playing on affinities, and where established codes can be deconstructed but at the same time overcome. The plan is actually to put the artwork also into a social life, so in a bit maybe what we could call a social fabric, through what surrounds the artwork, anecdotes, short stories that we experience in life, but also interacting in social relations within our environment. I'm convinced that a common narrative must be built from this recognition of these particularities and collectively. So, how to show ourselves without showing ourselves in interaction with the others? This is the question that I think is important today in the way we run our art institutions and the way we would like to write art history as well. Since 15 years, I have been engaged in what I can call a situated practice. I mean, on the ground, long term, dealing with society around me, as well as being connected with international colleagues. On one side, working within a university, challenging academic classic curriculum, and since almost 3 years now, at Villa Vassiliev, a second space that we opened in Montparnasse, we've been working closely with museum collections and archives by bringing artists and researchers to connect with these resources, very often hidden from the public. Most of the community of artists and thinkers that Villa Vassiliev is developing, our relations with are neither insiders or outsiders, maybe more iconoclast. They assemble their own experience with collective memory. They play and embody the sharp oppositions that our society is made of, like between authenticity and modernity, the everyday anecdotes and how they are experienced. They kind of build bridges in various forms of hybridizations or creolization between different cultures. We are interested in the political context they had to deal with, their friendships, the way these artworks traveled and were perceived differently in different contexts. But we're also interested in how they constituted communities around them, defying tradition, identity, and borders. I now would like to introduce you to a fantastic source of knowledge that we are working with since the opening of Villa Vassiliev. Here you can find the space, which is like in a very charming alley of Montparnasse. And this is the studio where we invite artists and researchers through the Pernod Ricard Fellowship. And this is the photographer Marc Vaux I would like to introduce to you. This guy actually photographed artist studios for like all his life with the camera from the 20s till the 70s, and in total there are like 200,000 glass plates that were like bought by the Centre Pompidou after the death of Marc Vaux, and they are like about 6,000 artists represented in this collection of photographs. And for many years they were not really like used because most of them were on glass plates, very difficult to manipulate, and they were not considered like a good source of information because Marc Vaux is not like an artist, well-known photographer. So these photographs were mainly used for like catalogs, but not really taken as a real source of knowledge. And when we opened the Villa Vassiliev, we started to work with Pompidou on the process of digitalization of this collection of photographs, and it took like almost 2 years. And today, I think this archive is really online, and it can be a way for, I think, to approach the history of migrations in the Parisian art scene during the 20th century, since we can find in this collection of photographs many women artists or Jewish artists or Indian artists, Russian, a very international collection of artists who spent some time in Paris and asked Marc Vaux to come and take some pictures of their works. And by looking at the different boxes and images of this collection of photographs, we can actually trace some connections between artists, but we can also reassess some underexplored artists that we believe deserve more recognition. So here you can find Marc Vaux in his basement, and you can find the different boxes of this collection of photographs where names of artists are written. So you can see that there is actually Picasso, Matisse, but there are also many other artists which are not so well known, of course. And these are the boxes at the Pompidou storage before they got digitalized. This is a list that was available at the beginning of the digitalization process, where all the artists were indexed and the number of photographs and etc. This is an example of a glass plate of an artist called Esther Karp. We believe that she asked Marc Vaux to photograph several of her paintings in one glass plate, maybe because of lack of money and she could not afford to pay for several photographs, or maybe because she wanted to keep memory in urgency of her works. We don't really know why, actually. There is less information on these photographs, but sometimes you can find prints where you see the different places where the archives were used or borrowed, which is also quite interesting to better understand like how actually photography is being used in public collections. This is another example of Esther Karp's. Here you can find Wilfredo Lam in his like Parisian studio. I find this picture quite interesting because you really see him like surrounded by many objects, works, papers, references, and it actually helps to understand that the work was really like the work of art is something made in an environment and which is maybe like chaotic or difficult to trace back, but through photography sometimes we can really like understand that the work is really a work in process. And this is the group we actually formed at the beginning of the opening of Villa Vassiliev. We invited like an international group of curators and artists to spend some time in the archive and talk with Pompidou curators to see how we could be of any help and dig into these archives in a very like organic way somehow at the beginning, because you need to start somewhere. But it helped, I think, to open some doors because they did not really know where to start, and having a group of people like with energy to really dig into these boxes helped them to maybe start like some processes of indexation. This is the group extended again in a symposium we organized at Villa Vassiliev. And this is an example of how actually Antarixa, who came in residency at Villa Vassiliev to work on Fujita, actually could trace some more information about like Japanese presence in Paris by actually using the social media. And I think that after a while he could actually name all these artists on the picture, which it's very interesting to see that sometimes it's really like non-conventional way to research that can actually help to gather information. So I would like to focus now on actually one artist that I think deserves more like recognition. Her name is Pan Yuliang. I mean, I think it's important to really think how we can establish a genealogy of how individuals use the kind of multiple identity to express themselves and invent ways to not enclose themselves into their origins and move from tradition and express their singular plurality through their art. And I think this is the case of Pan Yuliang. So let me introduce you to her trajectory. First, I want to say that there are a lot of books that depict her life in the style of a female myth, which is symbolic of the modernism in China, either ideologically or artistically. Her story was even shot into a movie, Soul of a Painter, with like a famous actress enacting her role, Gong Li. But there is not much about her work. She actually died lonely in her shabby apartment in Paris in 1977 after having spent like 50 years in Paris without much recognition because she wasn't really corresponding to the official canon either in China or in France. She actually got like an exhibition before she died at the Musée Czernuski, but with other women, Chinese artists, so not even like a solo exhibition in an important place. So she's for me really like the example of a woman Chinese artist whose trajectory needs reassessment. She started her life the legend says in a bordel, and later became the first woman artist in the Chinese Republic to win an official scholarship to study in France. She then arrived in 1923 as a migrant Asian woman artist, and she remained on the fringes of a mainstream French art history as an ardent advocate for the representation of the female nude in Western style, but she sat on the periphery of Chinese society. Even today, it is pretty difficult actually to engage like with the works of Pan Yuliang in China. Here you can actually see some pictures of her in the Beaux-Arts art school with the Association of Chinese Artists, and besides her works in different places in Paris, and within her Parisian studio with her friends. Here you see a picture from '68, and some examples of her work. So I think in these paintings you can really understand the influence of maybe Fauvism and Impressionism in the use of vibrant colors, or the flattening of the surface. And so close position towards Western tradition, but the lines could also be more of an Eastern tradition, close to Chinese calligraphy, for instance. And I think that she was really a conscious agent of how she was perceived as a stranger, in the Parisian context, and that her works are actively negotiating discourses of the Chinese other, modern, contemporary, but using a lot of irony and exaggeration to express her Chineseness, as you can maybe see in this picture, and question and comment on the construction of difference. Here you can also see how she can speak about maybe identity and how we are perceived, and play with the stereotypes of the black body and the Indianness yeah, well, here you see again some more calligraphic lines, and you can find the presence of many masks, and it seems that it's a bit too many accessories maybe to materialize the Chinese identity. So I think when you look at these bodies and the representation of the dark hair, the reappropriation of native motifs and European postures, you can maybe understand that her art evolved within the flux of transformations, that conflicting dichotomies of East and West, tradition, modernity, male chauvinism, emerging feminism coexisted. She was depicting somehow Orientalism in France, both others from without, and her personal appropriation of this situation of being seen never from within or always from somewhere else. So here you can find a picture of another group that was formed by Nikita Chai, director of the Times Museum in Guangzhou, with artists and art historians, in which they started to investigate on the trajectory of Pan Yuliang from her time till today, between Paris and China. And so they went to the Anhui Provincial Museum in Hefei to where her works are mainly stored, to look at them. And here you can find the group asking for some of the works that were shown to them in this room and conditions, because these works are still not really considered valuable to be maybe shown properly, because they don't know how to deal with this woman who actually was maybe a bit too much Western based. And this is some archives that we found in Paris at Marianne Yen's archives, who used to be close to Pan Yuliang. And this is a work by Mia Yu, where she assembled the different findings that they could collect around this research. So in conclusion, I would like to really insist on the fact that immigrant culture is what makes a place vibrant. So I do hope that we can engage with the multiplicity of self-expressions of this vitality, and hopefully we will go further than mere representation and contribute to transversal navigations capable of deeply transforming our institutions. Working with the Mark Vaux collection of photographs, we tried to turn things inside out and use, as Ariela Azoulay says, the archive to reverse the order of things. We try to imagine an alternative to the national institution of the archive that is reclaiming a more public multiple use of the archive, capable of transmitting a more complex narrative of history that enables emancipation and knowledge. The phase one was pretty much concerned in consolidating the relationship between the museum and us, getting to know the Fonds Mark Vaux, and building a community of professionals around it. We have also started to establish connections with teachers who felt rejected from the museum, like the teachers who actually got rejected from the Musée d'Orsay a year ago because the students were maybe making too much noise or they did not have the right attitude, and this was like problematic for some people in the museum, which I find very problematic because this was their first maybe visit to a museum, and the first thing they are told is that they don't have the right attitude and that they should go out. So several teachers were like really offended by this and started to gather together and then with us to see how we could actually connect these young people with museums in a different way. And phase two is now really like the time for us to involve these young people who feel excluded and reclaim like the institutions all together. So we have started to work with some students in high schools in the suburbs on year-long projects involving them in how we can challenge like hegemonic narratives of history and a fixed conception of identity and nationhood by having them work like with artists and art historians on different projects that we are now ready to develop like a bit more fully. So thanks a lot. I hope this was not too long and hope to meet you soon. Bye.